Good afternoon, and welcome to our latest episode of Engagement Experts 101. This is our live podcast where we cover a variety of HR and people topics. My name is Stephen Huerta, and as usual, I'll be your host. Today, we're focusing on a leadership competency that's received a lot of attention the last couple of years, empathy. I thought I would kick us off today by looking at the definition of empathy, which is the ability to understand and share the feelings of another. Empathy is a vital leadership competency. Many feel it's the single most important management skill needed in today's workplace. I'm a big believer in compassionate leadership, which is having the ability to understand the needs of others and being aware of their feelings. Unfortunately, this approach to leadership has historically been viewed as soft or non-essential, but the workplace is going through a profound shift, and many leaders are struggling to get the same results in engaging their teams. Many companies are now recognizing there's a need for a different way. There's also the impact of technology, which has been pretty profound. Technology has sped up the flow of information, and it's blurred the boundaries between work and personal time. So the increasing need for empathy in the workplace is also largely driven by the use of technology as a primary source of interaction. In my opinion, one of the key elements of a thriving workplace moving forward will be the ability to embody empathy as an organizational and cultural value. This is what we'll be digging into today. Before we jump into the conversation, I want to remind you all of a few housekeeping items. We'll kick off the session with a quick poll that will allow you to provide some real-time input into the discussion. From there, we'll have a short 20-30 minute conversation with our amazing guests, whom I'll introduce to you shortly. Then we'll tee up our Ask Me Anything AMA section, which will allow you to ask questions directly to today's speaker. As always, this discussion is for you. So please ask and drop questions into Zoom at any point in time. With that said, let's get started. My colleague Oksana will be launching a quick poll. So please share your feedback. We'll come back to these questions later in the discussion. Now I'm really excited about our guest today, who is a seasoned HR executive and a great friend of Workify. So thrilled to have you today. Welcome, Jakob Franzen. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate being here.
So before we jump into the meat of the conversation today, I like to start with a question, or I guess a way of kicking off the live podcast, which I stole from Brene Brown, which is like, what's your story? How did you get to where you are today? Tell us a little bit about yourself and your personal journey.
Sure. Well, I can tell you my path has not been a direct one. Like most of us, it's had lots of twists and turns. My career in HR started about 34 years ago. I was an intern for the city of College Station while I was attending classes at A&M. And I went from there to go ahead and pursue a full HR career and became a generalist and worked in education, government, healthcare, industrial services, technology, even biotechnology. Wow. So I've been a little bit all over the map as far as industries are concerned. And, I also had the opportunity to specialize in comp and benefits, employee relations, and even HRIS. So I had an opportunity to do all sorts of bits of HR. And then the latter part of my career, I was in the executive offices and had an opportunity to regularly coach CEOs that I reported to, as well as their executive teams, and sometimes members of the board as well. And as life went on, that was my career. And not too long ago, I experienced some significant changes in my life. My husband passed away unexpectedly in 2019, and all of a sudden, the way I was working just didn't make any sense anymore. And so I decided that, everything that I had learned toward the end of my career in coaching and, being present for executives and helping them take that next step to level up would be the next logical step for me. And so, I decided I would go ahead and hang out my shingle, and I kicked things off just as the pandemic came into play. So it has been one challenge after another, but there is certainly so much opportunity in front of us as some of these things start to settle down.
Yeah, I relate to your story so much, just, from being exposed to a variety of different industries to the bouncing around, all the different areas of HR. What I love about your story is, with all the changes and ups and downs, that you've aligned yourself with something that you connect with personally, something that is needed immensely right now.
It's interesting because I often say that coaching is in my blood. It's always kind of been something I've done, whether it's internally as an HR person or now that I've been trained. And it's interesting because the profession of coaching is a little bit like the Wild West. You've got a lot of people calling themselves a coach without any sort of training or experience. And I decided to take a different path. I've taken a much more disciplined approach to coaching. I studied at an accredited school, and I'm a credentialed member of the International Coaching Federation. And so when my husband died, I had an entire year of what I call swings and misses. But then, of course, decided that I should go ahead and hang out my shingle. And after doing that, being able to align myself and find the right connection just was not something that was easy. And in the beginning, I really tried to avoid talking about my trauma of loss. And I felt like it might be unprofessional to do that. And then people also seem to be really uncomfortable in hearing about it. And it took some time, but I have finally allowed it to help me find my voice. And while it doesn't define me or even define how I coach, it is definitely a part of who I am right now. One of the things that's always fascinated me is the fact that humans are emotional creatures, and they crave connection, both in work and in personal life. And the pandemic really offered me an opportunity to look at what was going on in the world, both through an HR lens, as well as an executive coach. And I had a chance to explore empathy through storytelling, because I just recently wrote a book called No Proper Grief. And the book is an exploration of my own journey from loss to resilience. And, in looking at everything that was going on in the world, I could see that the world was hurting, and I found a way to expand my own empathetic understanding through my storytelling.
That's so awesome. Yeah, for me, that really resonates, and I think that the pandemic had that effect on a lot of us. For me, it forced me to find new ways of connecting with people. I'm a bit of an extroverted introvert, but I completely lost a connection with others that I do need in my life. And the answer for me has been podcasting, which, in addition to this podcast, I have a separate podcast called The Modern People Leader, which has filled some of that void for me. Not completely; it's still not the same, but I found joy in a new aspect of my life that I created during that period. So awesome to hear your story. And I haven't read your book, but I have it on my list of books too. And your book's called No Proper Grief. Is that
That's
right?
Correct. Yes.
And can that be found on all of the on Audible, Amazon, all the usual places?
There's not an audio version yet, but it is available wherever you buy books.
Got it. Great. Well, so getting to the topic, what is it about empathy that has led you to focusing your career on the topic?
So that's actually a deep question, but I will
That's how we roll. That's how we roll on this show.
I'll jump in and kind of start with my own fancy definition of empathy. And, it is a skill that plays a critical interpersonal and societal role, and it enables the sharing of experiences, needs, and desires between individuals, and it provides an emotional bridge that actually promotes pro-social behavior. So all of that said really means that we have to be able to perceive the emotions of others, resonate with them emotionally, and cognitively take in their perspective and distinguish between what we feel and what they're feeling. The complicated interplay of all of these neural networks and emotional capacity is what's at the heart of coaching. And so, especially for someone like me who practices what I call holistic coaching, because I hold myself out as an executive coach because that is easy to understand, and certainly in my market, something people can relate to. But holistic coaching allows me to pull work and life together so that when I work with a client, we don't divorce their humanity from who they are at work.
Oh, yeah. And I think with all the boundaries of work and life having been blurred over the last couple of years, I can get behind that. So I love it. I love it. So why should you divorce your humanity from who you are at work? It seems crazy that we've operated in this way for all these years. Do you cover some of this in your book?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I have a chapter in the book where I talk about exactly that. Part of
Okay.
my story includes, taking on an executive role that wasn't quite right for me after my husband died. And because of a lack of empathy in that environment, I found myself constantly trying to divorce myself from what was going on in my life every time I sat down at my desk. So, when I did that, when I tried to be two separate people, that led to less than perfect results, obviously at home and at work. So the book itself is, this raw account of that loss, and it is kind of my effort to make a story somewhat more universal, even though it is my story, because loss is something that we all experience in some form or fashion, and people get uncomfortable when they talk about it, and they want to put it neatly in a box and put a time limit on how long people should grieve.
Mm-hmm.
And and while the book is largely about loss and resilience, it's an exercise in empathy itself, because loss makes so many people uncomfortable and they avoid talking about it. It makes the perfect example of the cognitive cost of empathy, because we avoid things that make us uncomfortable. Many leaders avoid empathy because to exercise our empathetic muscles means that we have to pay the toll, just like going to the gym.
Yeah, and I have so many questions that I want to ask. I'm ready to get into the conversation itself, but before we do that, let's take a look at the quick poll results from earlier, and let's see what people have to say. So the first question was, psychological safety is a priority for our organization in 2022. Wow, 63% strongly agree. I expected the number to be of agree and strongly agree. In this case, it is 79%, almost 80%, are saying that it's a priority for the organization this year. Does that surprise you? What are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all, actually. Psychological safety is a huge motivator for employees. And I think, kind of given the current employee migration that we're seeing, that is definitely indicative of people looking for stronger psychological safety.
And for those on the call, the podcast recording, we Workify just published, our IO psychologists published our latest pulse survey template, which is called Psychological Safety at Work. And so you can find that on our website, or you can follow up with me directly. And I can, if you're interested in that, I can make sure you get that. And obviously, we're going to talk more about that here as we go through the conversation. The second question, my organization plans to invest in strengthening empathy in the workplace. We've got 37% are say absolutely, 21% are thinking about it. And then we have those that would like to, but may not have the support yet, and those that are just don't have any plans. So I think this makes this adds up with what I was expecting. I think this is a topic that a lot of us would like to invest in. It feels like I made the comment earlier that historically this has been viewed as a soft skill, or a nice to have, and I think that that there's still some mindsets that need to shift on this topic. Would you agree with that, Jakob?
Absolutely. And I completely agree. This distribution does not look unexpected to me.
And then we have the last question: leaders at my organization have received emotional intelligence training or coaching. This is a little surprising to me. I would have thought this would have been higher in the agree, strongly agree. What are some of the barriers to getting I guess the buy-in and I guess the budget to invest in this kind of coaching? What have you seen as being some of the barriers or obstacles for companies?
I think some of the barriers that we tend to see have to do with, just buy-in, because I think from the executive team, you have to have that buy-in to create a coaching culture, as well as a culture that embraces compassionate leadership. So that is definitely top on the list, I would think. The other is that it's hard to find good training in this kind of stuff, because you can get people to come in and give a workshop, and so often it's a one and done. And empathy and compassion are things that we have to work at and that take time to build. And you just don't get it out of a one-day workshop. So absolutely a definite barrier.
Well, it looks like there's a comment that the audience may not have been able to see the results, and we're going to be moving on to the meat of the conversation. We're happy to share the results as part of the follow-ups from this session. So let's jump in. The hour goes by in these conversations. I want to make sure we have enough time to allow our audience to ask us some questions. So in your opinion, Jakob, why is empathy such a trending topic? I have been in the HR people space for 20 plus years now, and I don't think I've ever seen a topic trend like this, on the EQ side, like empathy is today. So what are your thoughts on why this is trending? Is this just buzz or another HR fad? What's your view on this?
Well, I think the pandemic absolutely underscored the importance of having leaders with a developed sense of empathy. The pandemic has also irrevocably changed the way that we work. And so, it kind of highlighted this need that we have for leaders that are more compassionate and have a highly developed sense of empathy. And because the workplace is not going to change anytime soon, we are well down a new path. I think that empathy itself deserves all the buzz and the airtime that it's getting right now. It's quickly becoming what I would classify as a core competency for a leader. So one of the things, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that we're seeing in what has come to be called the Great Resignation is, more and more people are leaving, and we're learning that money is not quite the motivator that we thought. And I mean, that's not to say that we don't need to pay competitive salaries and that those things are important, but other aspects of work that are rooted in corporate culture and the way that people are treated at work, those have become just as important, if not more so. And so the competition for talent has become really fierce. We're seeing that every day. People are not only looking for an organization where their pay aligns to their perceived worth, but they're also looking for a place where they can really belong. They want to feel valued, and most importantly, they want to be seen. And that particular fact is not going away.
Yeah, and I know we'll dig into this a little bit later, but this topic, we're discussing empathy, but there's so many. It feels like pretty complicated. Like there's a empathy component, there's a belonging component, there's a compassion component, and all these things relate.
Right.
And so I want to pick that apart a little bit later, but just reacting to what you shared, I'm a big believer that the pandemic didn't create these new realities. It just exposed and accelerated some shifts that were already in motion. And I think the same holds true here. Do you think that organizations and leaders have been caught flat-footed on the importance of empathy and other trends like belonging?
Absolutely. And, I will say that me and many of my HR colleagues over the years have been heralding these particular shifts at work. We've been saying they're coming, and we've had our executive teams look at us like we have three heads. But, if you really dig a little more deeply into the research, you'll find that there are large bodies of work out there about being a more human leader. There are scholarly papers on how to find your purpose at work and what it means to be a purpose-driven organization. The pandemic itself was really just an accelerant to a fire that had already been kindled. And part of what we're seeing in this great resignation that's happening is this migration of employees from workplaces that have become toxic to organizations that they see as, being able to see them as more fully human. and they want to be met where they are. And so this is especially true of organizations that have made a really clear decision to say that they are either a remote first organization or that they are a workplace first organization, but they also embrace any employee who needs something differently than their primary focus.
And do you think that there's a generational component to this as well? Like, I know that the needs were really, in my experience, or if I reflect on, the 20 years I've spent in HR, like it feels like this movement started with millennials, but there's been a lot of press lately about Gen Z and some of the needs that may have started with the millennial generation are now like really starting to accelerate in the importance of topics like empathy and belonging are now like critical decision making factors in Gen Z, who they're choosing to work for. And so are you seeing the same? Is there some truth behind that statement?
I think so. And I think, what we're seeing with Gen Z entering the workforce was the wave that was going to hit us anyway. Um, but, as it relates to what has happened during the pandemic and this whole idea that we've all been sequestered at home, I think you see other generations suddenly realizing the value of this as well, because you have people who suddenly were able to find more balance in their lives, people who are further in their career, people who are managing children at home, people who are, suddenly do not have to commute an hour each way to work. There's suddenly this, new approach that is unfolded to their life, and they don't want to let it go. And what they're finding is exactly what this younger generation has been demanding to have all along.
Yeah. And so let's start looking at like the organizational aspect. So what are the traits of a company that is cultivating empathy in the workplace?
Well, so I think
How do you know if like you've got a functioning, culture that is embracing empathy?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, like anything else, it's got to start with the leadership team, and the top executives have got to be on board with wanting an organization that embraces empathy and that puts empathy into its DNA. And what that means is the organization's leadership has to have a keen awareness of culture. And, I mean, as you've probably seen over and over in your work, there are lots of organizations who get surprised by the culture that develops because it's not the one that they intended.
Yep.
And so there has to be a huge awareness on how culture is developing and what it means, because it can be a very buzzy kind of word, but it's got to be something that's understood by everyone in the leadership, in a leadership role, to be able to cultivate empathy, because culture is organic and organizations have to understand that their culture ultimately gets modeled on how people treat each other at the top, and it becomes a part of daily life and any part of the organization. And I think anyone who manages people in an organization, they have to have a growth mindset. And by that, I mean, they have to approach leadership with an open mind and a capacity for change. So often in my career, I've heard people say that's just the kind of leader I am. Well, leadership is not fixed. It's got to evolve, and you've got to have an open mind and a growth mindset to evolve with it. So they've got to be able to grow their own awareness. And then finally, I think a company has got to invest in its knowledge of empathy. We talked a little bit about this in the quick poll, and they've got to push their HR team to develop their own understanding of empathy and what empathy means, and they should have ongoing coaching about empathy. Because after all, empathy isn't a one and done kind of skill. It takes practice and it takes work. So companies have to invest and revisit situations where many of their employees may have a swing and a miss. They need to be able to have empathy, where those kinds of things are concerned, because every time we use our empathy, it just gets stronger and we are able to enhance that skill.
Yeah. So if I'm understanding you correctly, empathy is a competency or a construct that really needs to be part of the cultural fabric of the company. And so if that's the case, for the audience members out there that are trying to integrate empathy into their cultural values, like how should they start? Most companies already have a set of values, usually at a minimum words on posters, or framed in the office, in the hallways, or whatever virtual equivalent exists of that now. And so for how would you start working toward this, if this is something that's new and doesn't just organically already exist in your company?
Yeah, I think, we've got to understand first and foremost that empathy is a neurobiological competency. And that's just a really fancy way of saying that as humans, we are hardwired for empathy. And so one of the best starting points for any company is simply to acknowledge that there are people all have this capacity. This is not something that some people have and some don't. We all have it at our core as a human. But then I think they have to take it a step further, because I think we have to acknowledge that there are three primary types of empathy that are important in the workplace. And the first is cognitive empathy. The second is emotional empathy, and the third is compassionate. Because cognitive allows us to truly understand what someone is going through and what their challenge is. Emotional is to be able to actually feel those emotions as if they were contagious. And then compassionate empathy is to be moved to do something, be moved to help if it's appropriate. And so mastery of empathy in an organization takes someone who can understand these three types of empathy and to know which ones to use and to what extent to use them in any given situation. And so that should be really the goal of any leader in an empathy-based organization. And so if we're thinking about developing empathy in a culture, it's really all about encouraging people to get out of their comfort zone, because empathetic leaders, they have to hone their curiosity and they need to ask questions about their team, and they need to seek feedback. And on a more personal level, they should really embrace their own approaches to things like travel and experiencing different cultures. They need to also put down their business book of the week, and they need to pick up a novel. And I say that because reading fiction is such a great way to be able to understand and experience the trials of someone else. And, please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the business books are bad, but throw a novel in there from time to time so that you can experience what someone else is feeling in a fictional story.
It's guilty as charged. And I think this is the first big learning I'm having from this conversation. Is I honestly didn't realize there were three components or three primary types. There may be more, but of the three, there's cognitive, emotional, and compassionate. I think my barriers with the cognitive piece, it just being kind of like front of mind, and the awareness. Once I am like aware, or like my cognitive empathy is triggered, I feel like my emotional and compassionate, those aspects of empathy kind of fall into place. But it's not always where what my brain is centered on. And so super super interesting. And so I mentioned the topic of compassionate leadership in the intro, as before we jumped into the discussion. What does compassionate leadership mean to you, and why do you think companies should explore it?
Well, before I jump into this answer, just to be clear, compassionate leadership, of course, rolls up a whole lot of things, and empathy being one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But to answer the question, the idea of compassionate leadership, I think, starts with leaders who understand and are able to show themselves compassion. Because unless you can be compassionate with yourself, you're never going to be able to show compassion to others in a meaningful way. It's been my experience as an HR professional and with my clients as a coach that leaders have a severe lack of compassion for themselves. As leaders, we tend to wear busy as a badge of honor. We work long hours, we stay up too late, we don't take breaks, and we see anything that doesn't immediately contribute to productivity as a waste of time. And so that kind of thinking is toxic, and it contributes to a toxic culture. And so a compassionate leader prioritizes themselves so that they can also prioritize their teams. A compassionate leader is going to engage in self-talk, personal self-talk that calms and inspires them, and they laugh at their awkward bits, because life is awkward, and this idea of pretending it's not isn't going to further good leadership. So being able to laugh at yourself when it's appropriate is important. And I think ultimately, compassionate leadership is about recognizing that every team member is a unique individual, but they're also an essential part of the organization. And so a compassionate leader is going to have a focus on the well-being of their team members, and the goal is going to be able to help those team members excel. And I mentioned some of this earlier too, this idea the world is on fire right now. We've got pandemic raging, hopefully ending. Unemployment has been difficult, and talent is hard to find. Russia has invaded the Ukraine, and more than ever, employees need to be seen at work, and they need to be able to know that they're making a contribution to their organization. And so when you invest in compassionate leadership, it doesn't mean that you're going to abandon all the other qualities that you find important in a leader, but compassionate leaders are going to have that as just part of their profile, right? They're still going to excel at all of these other things that we think make good leadership.
Yeah, I love that last comment. One of the best pieces of advice that I've received as I started moving up in the organizations I worked for was like, Stephen, there's a lot of feedback for you, but you shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. And that's kind of what I'm hearing here is like, you don't have to abandon all the other things that have made you great as a leader and as a contributor to the business. This is in addition to rather than in lieu of. And so how do you typically pitch compassionate leadership or a need to focus on things like empathy to the reluctant executives?
Well, I think, and certainly to tag on to what you were just saying, we celebrate what's already going well about their leadership. So often I find with executives, they miss opportunities to celebrate the things they do well because they're so focused on outcomes. Taking a moment to celebrate what they do well is important. And then, the executives I'm working with typically want to up their game. They're looking to kind of level up on the leadership playing field. And so, they're already doing a good job, but they want to go from, being a good leader to being a great leader. And so we'll use that as this foundation about where they can take their leadership. And we begin to talk about things like being able to build a high sense of resilience into their teams, being able to foster a team spirit and a sense of psychological safety, and being able to boost team engagement. And then ultimately, especially in these days, being able to reduce turnover, which is a big result of things that you can get out of being a more compassionate leader, because it's like, who doesn't want those things? And so when you lead with empathy, it can create this sense of confidence in the people that you're leading that will replace fear. And so that confidence and psychological safety that people begin to feel with a compassionate leader allows them to feel a greater sense of commitment to the organization. And that for sure is a selling point.
Right. Yeah. I don't know about, the audience members out there, but in a lot of the conversations we're having with our clients, there is the great resignation, the great awakening, whatever you want to call this massive turnover event, is still front of mind, and it's like burning hot. It hasn't really cooled off. And a lot of the executives, when they see the data, that we provide to them, they want to know how to fix things. Like, we just need to stem the bleeding. We just need to get a handle on this. So HR, take care of it. Right. And I don't think the leaders are prepared, or they're looking outward. They're not really looking inward. And so, I'm just curious, what's your advice on how to start that conversation? We, for example, with Workify data, in our engagement model, we look at leadership as a construct, right? And we measure that specifically. And so if we see the scores for leadership are low, we advise our clients, this may be a way that you can start these conversations with your leaders, and you can look at your quantitative data results, compare it to the qualitative data results, and then tell the narrative on what needs to change within leadership. that's one way we do it. What advice do you have for like starting like that conversation with leadership teams? Like, hey, the problem isn't necessarily an HR problem to fix. Like, yes, there are things that we can address here, but we need to examine leadership, how leaders are operating here at the company. Like, how do you start that? That's kind of a scary, just even saying this hypothetical conversation that I'm having with these hypothetical leaders, that feels a little stressful to me. And so how do you see that playing out with some of the companies you're working with?
Well, and it's, it gets down to embracing a coaching culture, because in a coaching culture, there is a sense of psychological safety to be able to have those kinds of conversations. And so they're scary to have at first when it's not the norm. And I think if you're looking at leadership scores and talking about leadership as a construct in data that you've gotten back from from survey results, I think it's so important to then head down that path of, let's talk about leadership competencies, right? Because we can all agree there are competencies that organizations have assigned to their leaders, but is empathy one of those competencies? And if it's not, then you don't really have the makings of a compassionate leader. And so by starting that conversation of like, let's add this competency and make it a part of who we are as leaders, that can lead to a whole lot of success when you're working on things internally, I think.
And the reason we should do that is the business value that you mentioned earlier, of what reducing turnover, et cetera, et cetera. So love it. Well, what are a few of the common challenges that you see with companies that are not practicing empathetic leadership, in addition to some of the things that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I would add on is the idea of burnout. We're seeing a lot of that happen as the pandemic is starting to subside. There have been a lot of difficulties for people to be able to embrace any sort of balance. I have coaching colleagues who have moved the focus of their practice to be entirely on burnout, because burnout it's not alleviated by a week in the Caribbean. Sometimes true burnout can take a year or more to be able to undo. And so there's a whole lot of work that has to be done, but people who are practicing empathetic leadership, they're able to see that quickly. They're able to see the beginning of burnout in their teams, because they're being empathetic and they're being able to lead in an empathetic fashion. But if we don't catch it soon enough, then those people who are burning out are going to start to exit, and they're going to start to exit quickly. And then we've kind of lost our momentum. The other thing is, I think, a change of focus, for leaders to not only look at productivity, right, and outcomes, because we can all agree we're all very focused on that, because that's the nature of business, is we want to do well and we want the business to succeed. But we also need to change our focus and talk about people, and we need to be focused on kind of what drives our people, what challenges them, what does loss make them feel, what does personal home life challenges make them feel, just things that we didn't really think about. Because for many people who may be in my age bracket, when we started working, you checked your personal life at the door. It shouldn't even be in your briefcase, because yes, we carried those back then.
Sure did.
And before you booted your computer with 2 floppy disks, you had to check your personal life, and anything that may have been bothering you, whether that be a relationship, whether that be you're trying to buy a new home, whatever that was, that got left at the door. And I don't think that we can do that. I think we need to really understand what our folks are going through. And then so much of this comes back to the idea of psychological safety. That is one of the things that often doesn't get taken seriously, and I think it needs to, because as we evolve and we've got people working from home and we've got people working in the office, then we need to really kind of understand what's going on and make it a safe place for them, and understand that sometimes people are managing these blurry lines between work and between personal life, and creating open lines of communication, creating more transparency. All of that's a real challenge for people, but it creates this sense of psychological safety that is, going to help people understand that they can be seen and they can be who they are, and they are not at risk, or their livelihood is not at risk for simply being who they are.
Yeah, I think on the, we should invite you back just to talk about psychological safety. That's come up already many times in this conversation, and I think it's, it's a blind spot, and I think a lot of leaders, think they are creating a psychologically safe environment for their employees, and this is, the one point I want to make, I mentioned our survey template earlier that we just published. Literally, it was just published this week. But getting data to support whether or not your employees, rather than debating with your leaders as to whether or not you have a psychologically safe work environment, it's important to get data from your employees, particularly after the last couple of years that we've all been through and so much change in the way we work. I think that is a really, really important thing. And it's one of the top trending topics that we're seeing in client conversations and in conversations I'm having with HR executives. And so I can see that completely as being a dimension of a company that has the empathy and compassion built into their organization. And so let's talk about leadership competency specifically. And, we've talked about, why it's important. We've talked about how to, understand what are some of the red flags if you are not, fostering a culture of empathy. Now we know where our organization, I've added the merits of getting data, so you can use data to drive some of these conversations. Let's talk now. People are on board. We know we need to focus on, empathy for this hypothetical company. How do you start building this competency for leaders in the organization?
Well, and I think you hit a very important point to start this out. Everybody's on board, right? The leadership has to decide that empathy as a competency is important to the organization, and it's got to be part of the daily dialogue. They need to have it as part of the conversations that they have, talk about empathy, appreciate it for what it is, have a shared definition of what it is and what it means in that particular organization. I think the other piece of this is people should never think of empathy training or any sort of training that we do to raise awareness around empathy as a one and done. And I've said this a couple of times today. Empathy, for it to be able to flourish, you have to think about it like going to the gym, because it's a muscle that has to be exercised often, and leaders have to be coached often in how they're engaging in empathy. And so, leaders need to raise their awareness around their own kindness and their ability to be genuinely curious about their team members in order to start to flex those empathy muscles. And I think the competency also has to be required at all levels of the organization. You can't just say, this is something the C-suite is going to do this week, is be more empathetic. I think empathy has got to be encouraged, not only at the top, middle managers, and also everyday individual contributors need to understand the importance of empathy and the role that they play in the organization. Because I think, and again, I said this about having room to make a big mistake. People need to be able to know that they can make mistakes and that they can learn and grow from those mistakes. And that again gets back to this idea of psychological safety, of being able to, be managed by someone who understands the challenges of a new task or having to use new skills and what that may mean when you're successful or not successful at that.
Yeah, I completely see that, and I just realized these conversations just go so quickly, Jacob. So the last formal question I have for you, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. And I just sent a reminder through the chat to drop in any questions you guys have. If there's one action a company can take regarding culture, regarding empathy, what should that be?
I think, and I can't emphasize it enough, is I think companies who want to embrace empathy need to adopt a coaching culture. Because that kind of culture fosters the growth of empathy. It allows for the ongoing working out of that muscle, because empathy is something that has to be cultivated, but it's a complex skill, and we're not going to get it right every time. Even people who practice it often somehow just get it really wrong on occasion. And so it has to be about creating this connection with other humans and letting them know that they're not alone and that someone else is bearing witness to their life. And I think that's at the core of a good coaching culture.
Yeah, I know a mutual friend of ours, Sam Baber, who is just a phenomenal person, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for him. He is the head of talent management for a company called Storable. The way that they approach this is they designed manager training, and there are like two components. And what they did was they included some of this, their approach to creating a coaching culture was all managers had to go through these training modules that they had, and I think there were two or three. And empathy, some of these components, some of these topics that we're discussing today that relate to empathy, they were all included as part of these mandatory manager training courses. And that was kind of their way, and that just popped in my head as I heard you talking. Yeah. It feels like a practical way of doing that at scale. I don't know if you have any thoughts or kind of more specific examples on ways that you could adopt and embrace a coaching culture.
And I think that is a perfect example, actually, just, because what Sam has done is just to make it part of, what it is to be a manager at that company, and I think it kind of gets back to what we talked about of you've got to embrace it at the top, and it's got to be something that's expected at every level. And, if you're going to say these are the competencies that we require from anyone moving into a leadership role, then they have to be clear, and working them into your manager training, I think, is an excellent way to foster that.
Awesome. Well, we have reached that point. We're 2 minutes over the AMA segment, and so I'm going to quickly shift us into the questions we have, and please, guys, keep them rolling if you have any questions that you would like Jakob to answer. The first question is from an anonymous attendee. Thanks. This is awesome. Can you share some red flags? I know we shared some, but can you share some additional red flags, Jakob, that show whether or not you are fostering a culture of empathy?
I think one of those red flags, especially if you're in the HR organization, is how many people seek out HR versus how many people sit down to have an open conversation with their manager. This gets back to the idea of psychological safety and a manager being able to empathize with them and being able to have those kinds of general conversations. Because when that feeling of connection isn't there, employees are going to seek out other means to be able to express themselves and find a way to be seen.
And so, are you suggesting that if people keep coming to your HR team to discuss these things, then you may not have a culture of empathy because they should be going to their managers or leaders to talk about?
Absolutely. And certainly in context, I mean, there are a lot of reasons an employee should go see their HR representative. But HR should be taking a look at what are we fielding here, and should that be handled by a competent leader in the organization.
Got it. Any other examples that you can think of? Any other red flags?
I think
we talked about attrition, right? We talked about turnover. So a department, if you look at your attrition data and you have what we call employee experience surveys. I know from, I'm coming at this more from a data angle because that's what we do. But one of the things that we know is in exit survey data, we always recommend asking a question, force rank, prioritize the reasons that led to you choosing to leave the company. And we always, and in that there is, we include, my manager experience, or specifically there could be a separate question that would ask your employees as they're leaving, would you choose to work with your manager again? And while that data isn't completely connected, that is one way that we have seen our clients, like as soon as they see in their aggregate exit survey data that there is a trend for particular managers, depending on what tool you use, you should be able to report on your demographic data. So you should be able to roll up their exit survey results by manager, and you'll be able to see, what the exit survey results, how they stack up, for various managers. That could be another way of a red flag. If you have a manager that is consistently scoring low on whether, exiting employees would choose to work with them again, I think that could be, where there's smoke, there could be fire. So that's another idea, suggestion that I have more on the data side. But sorry, I think I interrupted you, Jacob. Did you have another one?
No, and that's great, because I think you've got to use both qualitative and quantitative data in your assessment of these kinds of red flags. Another simple, more qualitative approach is asking a manager about their team, and being able to hear how much they know personally about the people on their team is going to be an indicator to you of how connected they are to those folks, especially if they're managing people both in the office and out of the office, because they should have an equal understanding of the people who report into them, regardless of where they're located.
Love it. Love it. Well, moving on, we've got a few more questions that we need to get to. Again, from an anonymous attendee, are the methods and tools you are recommending inclusive of the fact that individuals with neurodiversity may not always be able to physically or verbally express empathy in ways that are easily understood by others, and include coaching for others, and also creating a place where that individual can belong rather than just be judged harshly? It's a great question.
Well, it is. And so I, because of our time limits, did not delve in to the aspects of neurodiversity. Absolutely, I think you've got to take a lot of that into play here. And to be sure I understand the question, is the question from requiring empathy as a competency for someone who's neurodiverse as a manager, or managers managing people who are neurodiverse?
Let's assume the latter, just for the sake of time. And then, whoever anonymous attendee, if you want to add to the question, please do, either in the chat or the questions. But for now, let's assume, a neurodiverse manager.
Right. So, neurodiversity is just that. It is a diversity of who we are. And I think, there is a lot of empathy that has to happen on the person who is managing the manager who is neurodiverse, and understanding what their capacity is, and being able to make sure that you're building a track they can run on, because that's what all of this is about, right? Being able to be connected and understand what their challenges are and be able to see things from their perspective, then you're able to more effectively manage them. And we could probably create an entire other podcast
Right.
with other experts to come weigh in on this. But certainly I think if you are aware of neurodiversity in your team, then you've got to address it. You've got to take it into account.
And so, anonymous attendee that asked that question, thank you. You've given us a new topic for a future Engagement Experts 101, where we'll focus specifically on neurodiversity, because I think that is a complicated and also very, very important topic. Next question is from Bart. Can you share some thoughts about the interplay of empathy in building accountability in cultures?
Yeah, so these are all wonderfully deep and complex questions.
Yeah, you're not getting easy ones here. You're getting some good questions.
The good thing I love this topic, because so the whole idea in accountability is being able to operate to an understanding of what is expected. And this kind of gets us back to this idea of empathy being a competency in leadership. And so understanding how you measure that kind of empathy, and maybe it's in a lot of these data items that Stephen talked about earlier, psychological safety measures, turnover in the workplace measures, leadership scores. Maybe you're, using those as a guide to determine how effective empathy is. But when you're thinking about holding someone accountable to being an empathetic leader or a compassionate leader, you've got to decide what are those competencies that can be demonstrated as they relate to these things, so that you can have clarity around what your expectations are of someone in that particular capacity. And hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the reality is, if your organization is not, if accountability is a weak competency for your leadership team, meaning they are not holding themselves or other people accountable for the way the business is operating, you're going to have a very difficult time with your efforts in terms of creating a more empathetic leadership team, or integrating empathy into the culture, right? Because
Absolutely.
it will be lip service, or it'll be like the companies that just have core values that are written and framed on the wall. They're just words that are there, but they don't actually mean anything. And so, I do believe that not all leadership or management competencies are the same. And there's some that are precursors that for others. And in my belief, accountability in this question, accountability, I think, is a required competency in order to really instill empathetic leadership in the company, of the business. So great question, Bart. Moving on, we have a couple more. So anonymous attendee has asked, when doing surveys, how can we be certain that the employees are sharing facts? Fear of job loss could drive the results to show differently. Any suggestions on how we can ensure the employees that their answers are private and safe?
Well, I think that is probably all you on this one.
Yeah, I could take it. I was just curious if you had any thoughts. So there are two ways of looking at. So I think the first question is understanding your HR or work tech stack and the types of tools you're using. And you need to be very careful about how you describe, how you're labeling or positioning your surveys based on the tools that you're using. And there is a nuance between anonymous surveys and confidential surveys. And what it really, the difference, it comes down to, again, the platform that you're using for distributing surveys. And so there are tools that are like Workify that are truly anonymized, meaning there is no way that even if the CEO asks for to attribute results or response, then you can't get to it. Our client success teams that are supporting the business and our clients can't even get to the data. It just, there may be, a technical way to get to it, but those keys are locked and no one has access to that. And confidential surveys, which means there are a limited group of individuals that can't, usually the HR team, that can extract and attribute data. And similar to some of the other questions, this is a deeper conversation. So I would be happy to help whoever's asked this question. If you want to follow up with me, we can talk more about that. But my suggestion is to be intentional about how you're describing the surveys. And if they are anonymous, you should make that clear. And there are tools like we offer, like we have an anonymity pledge. We explain how it works. And we put that right up front on our website, and we provide links to that in every single survey that we deploy for our clients. If it's confidential, then you need to explain that and help them understand why there is, their identity will be protected, but why there's a need to be able to connect some of the results with your broader workforce analytics data and strategy. And so there are ways of doing it, but we're running out of time. So I would encourage whoever asked that question to set up time, and I would be happy to share how we've seen, our clients do it and other companies do it. Because obviously, I'm connected to a lot of executives and similar to Jakob that have used other platforms out there. So happy to answer that in greater detail. And unfortunately, we're gonna have to. Oh, there are, so a few other questions, but we're gonna have to wrap it up for today. Jakob, sorry, I didn't realize that there was a slew of questions that came in at the end. Thank you so much for joining us today. If our audience wants to find you, what is the best way of doing that?
One of the easiest ways to find me is by my website, which is mymoderncoach.com. Or you can email at info@mymoderncoach.com, and all of that I should be able to get directly. So.
Excellent. Well, as always, huge thanks to our audience for listening to what we have to share. Big thanks to you, Jakob, for joining us today. This was an awesome conversation. We'll look forward to having you back sometime.
Sounds great. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.